Cathleen McGuigan is Editor-in-Chief of Architectural Record and Editorial Director of Green Source, a sustainable design magazine. She previously served for many years as architecture critic and arts editor for Newsweek. During this time, she was awarded a Loeb Fellowship from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She has also served as adjunct professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Please welcome Cathleen McGuigan.
Thank you all. Oh, it's great kind of to look out here at this whole barn and these wonderful trusses and see all of you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm very honored to be here. When Donlin and Jackie Baas invited me, I warned them that I am definitely not an expert on the Sea Ranch, though I have learned to put the in front of Sea Ranch, so I hope that gives me some cred here. Of course, I'm a fan of this beautiful place, but I just haven't had the benefit of learning about it by coming here again and again over the course of many years, as so many of you have. But maybe this visit, which is not my first, but maybe this will be the start of something more regular. I hope so. So what I'm going to give you today are a few of my impressions of the Sea Ranch as a kind of distant observer about what struck me about its cultural history and how I see the design of the Sea Ranch in a wider context and how I see its ongoing influence. Oh, we have to get rid of that. There we are. You know, first of all, actually, to touch on something that Mitch said, for me, of course, at first, Sea Ranch is a romance. I mean, just the name of it, just the idea of it, and just all of the kind of associations that you get from the idea of romance, small r or large, romantic. And from those of us who learned about it from afar, it was obviously a utopian ideal, something of an abstraction, with those clusters of weathered wood, sloped roof forms against a sort of spectacular Arcadian landscape. I remember the first time I saw a black and white photo of the Sea Ranch in a book. You know, the architecture itself was underwhelming. It was quiet and unassuming, which was exactly what was intended. As I said, I think I'm the only East Coast person speaking at this symposium today, or the only person who lives on the East Coast, where I have my whole life. I've lived east of the Mississippi. And in the 1960s and 70s, as you know, New Yorkers had particular views about California, if they thought about it at all, which Saul Steinberg did not. Here, California is a place that you kind of go over on your way to China. But like a lot of other young people in the 60s and 70s, I had actual ideas about the culture of San Francisco and Northern California. Okay, what's happening, John? There we go. First of all, political protest was really a big part of that. I was too little to be marching in the streets in 1964, but I heard about the free speech movement at Berkeley, which was also like Sea Ranch, it's exactly its 50th anniversary this year. And of course, Northern California was about hippies and communes and peace, love, smoking pot. That was a big thing. And the beginnings of environmentalism. So the politics and the way of life seemed to have their own kind of romance, too, to sort of a child of the 60s. Without knowing much about it, I understood that the Sea Ranch was connected to all that, living free in a beautiful wild place, in harmony with nature, and creating a community. And I know now that Lawrence Halprin, in his planning, was influenced by the ideal of the kibbutz and the sharing. And again here, and I think Mitch touched on this, like the original settlers of the 1960s Sea Ranch kept a big chunk of open land jointly owned as a commons, a little bit like our European forebears, the earliest settlers, had done in small New England villages. Now, I looked back at some old issues of Architectural Record to see how Sea Ranch was covered by the profession. in its day. For those of you who don't know, Record is a magazine aimed at architects. It's about 120 years old and is considered, and still considers itself, the Record. That was really explained to me when I became the editor. So forgive how crummy these slides are because we do not have our archives digitized. These are in bound books that a very helpful intern helped me find. So this is the first article about Sea Ranch in November 1965. Record devoted a whole issue to second home communities. Again, touching on what Mitch said, this was a kind of a phenomenon of the era. And here is the Sea Ranch. The article very clearly outlined the precepts of the master plan and the principle of clustering the houses, and it printed, I'm going to try the pointer, this little diagram of the wind studies here. Is this working? Yeah. Going over here, unfortunately, going over the bluff and going over the sloped roof house is a little bit caught in the gutter here of the binding of the book. But they explained all that very carefully, which did differentiate it from some of the other second home communities in this issue of the magazine. They really explained the bioclimatic studies, as they called it, that the architects had made to determine the designs. Here are some of the houses published in that. The prototype houses reflect the character of the land. Okay, and then in 1973, Record has an annual feature called Record Houses, and getting into the Record House issue is a big deal. And in 1973, this house was published, described as an ingenious vacation house, and this you can recognize as a Binker barn, designed by William Turnbull with Charles Moore. One of the things that sort of struck me when I looked at these two articles was that there was a kind of a bit of a contradiction, just to get again to the point that Mitch raised about the resort community idea. You know, that despite the utopian vision that the founders, developers, and architects brought to the Sea Ranch, these were, as we've said, second homes and with private beach access. And on one hand, it seemed a little bit elitist. And not only that, but after the sort of fight over the private beach access, which took many years, there was a moratorium on building as the state of California wrangled with the issue of beach access. And when that was over, the property values here shot up even more. When I first came to Sea Ranch a couple of years ago, I was really surprised to learn about this whole thing that had transpired, and that when the Sea Ranch was planned 50 years ago, there were 1,000 miles of California coastline, but only 100 miles were then accessible to the public. So I know this is a big issue. At the same time, I think that the kind of utopian and democratic ideals of the Sea Ranch obviously were very much part of its development. And owning a house here may have been a treasure, but these certain kind of values that made it sort of an outpost of the Bay Area culture life came here and were imported by the Sea Ranch pioneers. So here is, you know, a picture of the Halprins, Lawrence and Anna with Charles Moore on the beach. Now back east, we isn't it great? What year do you think this picture is, Donlin, do you know? 65, right around the time. So we thought of San Francisco culture as, you know, the beat poets hanging out at City Lights bookstore, and, you know, we knew that San Francisco was a place that embraced all of those who rebelled against conventional artistic expression, very much unlike our idea of Los Angeles at the time, for example. So I was very struck by how the photographs I'm about to show you of Anna Halprin, Larry's wife, and an avant-garde dancer and choreographer who's not here with us today because she's on a trip somewhere else, right? She's 91 years old. There's an exhibition of her work right now at the Graham Foundation in Chicago. And here is a series, as most of you must know, Anna Halprin made dances often involving ordinary people to whom she'd give kind of movement instructions. And she did this in the city of San Francisco as well as at places like the Sea Ranch. These images document a project called Driftwood City, a kind of a interdisciplinary workshop that combined art with movement and other ideas, and took place at the Sea Ranch in July 1966, according to the Graham Foundation. But discussing this with Linda Jewell, she thinks it might be later, it might be 1968. But here's the dancers and the driftwood, more driftwood, building these kind of beautiful driftwood, little forest of driftwood sculptures on the beach. Do you remember this, Donlin? It's kind of wonderful. They just really capture something of an era so beautifully. And because this was a workshop, here are some people workshopping outside Condominium 1, which looks very spanking new in this picture. Oh, Larry's house? The one that burned down? Oh, of course it is, okay. Anyway, you get the idea. Speaking of the Halpern's house, somebody told me that the house, before it burned down, that deck did not, it's right there on the precipice, and the deck did not have a railing, and that Anna danced on the edge. You're right overlooking the sea there. I really like this idea of bringing dance here because it's, and especially dance, the movement of people who are not trained dancers, because it's really part of the experience of this place to be moving through the landscape. This place is there are beautiful views, but it's not just about looking at images or what we might take pictures of. It's really about being part of it and moving through it. So all of these images, when I looked at them, kind of reinforced my idea of my kind of romantic idea about Sea Ranch in the 60s as a kind of progressive, artistic, countercultural summer camp for grown-ups. Because I want to go back to the beginnings a little bit in the influence, because the architects of the Sea Ranch were all from Berkeley, and Donlin had suggested to me they were all surrounded by Bernard Maybeck's architecture and some of the other houses in Berkeley. This is Maybeck's Hillside Club, so they were very much grew up around these heavy timber framed shingled houses that kind of cling to the Berkeley hills, and the architects knew those so well. And of course, as we keep saying, they were also inspired by the vernacular architecture right on the site. You can't beat this barn. And again, Christopher just showed us the picture, but I think it's important to know that there was at least one important contemporaneous project that I think shared some strong similarities with the early architecture of the Sea Ranch, and that's Ed Barnes' Haystack School in Deer Isle, Maine, which was completed in 1961. It's much smaller, of course, less ambitious than Sea Ranch. It's about 40 acres, but it similarly sits on a rugged ocean site. It uses shingles, it uses sloped roofs, it creates sheltered outdoor spaces, and similarly sought to be part of the landscape using a modernist vernacular. Now here again, we're outside Condo 1. What year do you think this photo is?
Well, 25 year, the year we got the 25-year award.
The 25-year award. So here they are, Richard Whitaker, Donlin, Charles Moore, and William Turnbull. I looked in reading Donlin's book. Donald Canty wrote an essay in the book, The Sea Ranch, this definitive book, which is really a marvelous resource, that these architects and Joseph Escherick agreed early on that the architecture at Sea Ranch was not, quote, to be married to the site, but to enter into a limited partnership with it, which I think is a very good way of sort of talking about the Condo 1 with its really powerful forms and configurations, the real inventiveness of this. But as Canty also points out in the same essay in the book, the architecture that they created at Sea Ranch was heralded by some, but not widely appreciated in its time. The mainstream architectural world, this is his quote, quoting, quote, the mainstream architectural world was firmly in the hands of modernists who rejected regionalism and naturalistic design. And as we've all keep saying, the early houses were utterly self-effacing. Joseph Eschrick wrote, "The ideal building is one you don't see." Though the interiors were really inventive, and I'm staying in Eschrick's house this weekend. It's really wonderful. It's a very small house with all kinds of little unexpected uses of space inside, and these windows placed for absolutely spectacular maximum views, including a long, if you haven't been there, a long horizontal slot low to the floor in a niche that turns out to be just right if you're lying in bed to look at the horizon. And there's also a little ladder to one last little sort of space high up, which can be a loft for sleeping, though it did not strike me as a good place to explore after I'd had a glass of wine. I mean, it's like straight up. So they're marvelous inside, but on the outside, they're really not about image. You know, with their rustic wood cladding, they really were a little homey and hardly camera ready compared to the glamour of some of the Southern California modernist houses, which Christopher showed one case study house. Of course, I think Julia Schulman could make anything look glamorous and beautiful, but at that period, in a wide sense, people didn't really understand the houses here at the Sea Ranch. When Architectural Record published those houses as part of Record Houses in 1973, that house, the writer said, outside this way of building produces an effect that is downright modest, recalling simple rural structures. It has turned out that at the Sea Ranch, this assumption of modesty was wise, for as more and more houses are built on the open meadows, each more obviously, we'll get to them in a minute, each more obviously designed than the next, and each one competing with all the others for attention, there is the danger that the place may begin to look more like a statuary farm than the beautifully desolate landscape which it once was, and which the original developers, planners, and architects had sought with great care to preserve. So this was written in 1973, and I think that is quite prescient. So at that time, in the early 70s, mainstream architecture was beginning to move into postmodernism, and of course, Charles Moore was one of its leading proponents and critical thinkers. But again, I just had on the screen this small project by Robert Venturi, another postmodernist proponent. These are from 1972, a pair of shingled houses that Venturi did on the island of Nantucket, again on a bluff overlooking the sea. They were designed for two families who were related to each other. And one of the things I particularly like about them, and I'm sorry it doesn't really show in this slide, is the placement of the houses and their relationship to each other. I mean, if you see a slide from a far greater distance, you can see when they were originally built and there were no other houses near them, they had this special relationship, close but not too close, so the space between them really mattered. And it reminded me that, you know, Eschrick and the architects and other architects in Halpern also considered not just the architecture in and of itself, but how the relationships among the dwellings would be. But maybe we had to get beyond the postmodern movement and circle back later to really understand and appreciate the enduring influence of the Sea Ranch in architecture and planning. Later today, you're going to hear from Will Bruder, the Arizona-based architect, who will talk about his connection to some of the ideas that are embodied here. But he is far from alone among architects today. For example, beginning in the 1990s and now into the 21st century, there has been a kind of rebirth of regional or vernacular modernism, though it's a label that many of its proponents hate. But whether building in the desert, like Bruder often does, or his colleague Rick Joy in Arizona, or building in other kinds of landscapes, this is architecture that draws inspiration from and connects to the places where it is built. One of the finest of these architects, I think, is Brian Mackay Lyons, who is based in Nova Scotia, but has designed work in the US and as far away as India. Brian worked for Charles Moore in Los Angeles from 1980 to 1982, and he told me flatly, our work wouldn't be possible without the Sea Ranch. It was a place he came to many times with Moore. And looking to the vernacular architecture which inspired the architects here was what Moore called, according to Brian, maybe you've heard this, barnyard Bauhaus, forgive me, did you hear that? Brian also, really, what's very clear in his work and what he really extolled the craftsmanship of the early Sea Ranch houses, particularly the ones that William Turnbull was in charge of, this kind of incredible attention to detail and craft. So this is Mackay Lyon's Martin Lancaster House, which sits on the Nova Scotia coast. The local materials include the cedar shingles, the roofs have no eaves, there's a protective exterior wall, the windows are set for maximum views in connection to the outdoors in a very changeable climate, which is not unlike that here on the northern California coast. So I think you can really see, though this is highly refined, and it's also 3,000 square feet, it's more than one structure, it's three structures, they do connect. But you can really see the powerful influence of Sea Ranch there. So in the end, I think the legacy of the Sea Ranch is really about those kinds of values. Brian Mackay Lyon says that the Sea Ranch changed the world, that its utopian ideals embodied sustainability before that was even a word. And I think that really could not be a more important idea. Next week, I will attend the Green Build Convention in New Orleans, where there will be 30,000 architects, I'm not kidding, 30,000 architects, engineers, sustainability experts, and tens of thousands of exhibitors of building products. It's, a bigger convention now than the AIA. And it's great that the sustainable building movement has gathered so much force, though of course the planet is in much worse shape than it was 50 years ago when the Sea Ranch was planned. But as I wander through the exhibit halls next week and look at all the innovative widgets and, super thermal pane glass and elevators that are solar powered and automatic shade systems, as important as those things are, they don't do much to connect us with and connect the built environment to the natural world. And I think the key thing about the Sea Ranch is that the land and local conditions inspired the planning and design. The lessons were all here. The first mention in architectural record from 1965 referred to the Sea Ranch Land Management Plan as, quote, dynamic conservation. We have to remember that this land had history too. It had been harvested for timber, so there's no remaining first growth trees. It was grazed down to the nubs. It had been planted with non-native species. So the two radical aspects to me of the Sea Ranch in terms of sustainability is first, Lawrence Halpern's plan was to restore the land with native plants, to ban suburban lawns and therefore all the fertilizer that it takes to maintain perfect swaths of green, to plan the houses, to preserve view corridors and all of that, to maintain the meadow up to the houses. That is all part of the ecology of the Sea Ranch. And the second aspect, which is key, is how the houses were set. All the early houses were planned in response to existing conditions. You protect against the prevailing winds and create exterior shelter. You slope the roofs in response to the winds and eliminate eaves where the winds can whip around. We saw that in that little diagram in our early architectural record. You orient the house and its windows to take advantage of solar gain. This should not be a radical idea because people all over the world have been doing this kind of thing for their shelters for millennia. They know to use local available materials because they don't have anything else. They know how to sort of shelter their yurts or put a little stone structure against a hillside to protect it from the wind. But we lost all that native intelligence in the post-industrialized, suburbanized world. And the ecology of the Sea Ranch, in its origins of respecting nature, of being inspired by nature, of trying not to overbuild, of building houses that felt authentic with honest materials derived from the local vernacular, and at a scale that gave people what they needed but not much more, of creating communal spaces and in fact embedding the idea of community. These are all powerful values, and those are the values and the lessons of Sea Ranch to which we still need to pay attention. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much. For our first speakers, you were all great. It's a great first part of the program. So we are going to take a nice break for lunch, with even time for a little nap, one of those power naps. I would like to mention, as you're leaving, that at the front of the barn, George Rathmel is selling for a very reasonable price the barn book, which tells the story of how this wonderful space, which I think is probably being used to its greatest capacity today, how it was developed, how the barn was saved by sea ranchers, volunteers, and so take a look at that. We also have a little audience participation event in back with some butcher paper and sticky notes, where if you can think of one word that summarizes the Sea Ranch for you, I'd like to ask you to write it down on a sticky note and stick it up there. There's even a second layer underneath if the top layer gets too full. And at the end of all of this, I'm going to compile it and make a list and see how many words get repeated. That'll be interesting. But I didn't see a lot of repetition there. But think about it before you look at what other folks have written. And I think that'll keep it more honest. So that'll be up during the course of the day and any time. So I'd like to ask you to try to be back here around 1:15. I will begin the program again promptly at 1:25. So see you back here.